Hillary Clinton wore the kind of smile you learn only after decades of cameras, lights, and polite applause that never quite reaches the eyes. She started in with the familiar cadence, the practiced reassurance, the "I've served, I've learned, I've grown" rhythm that sounds comforting until you realize it's the same melody every time. Ben Shapiro didn't wait for a moderator's cue because waiting was the whole problem he came to talk about. He leaned in and cut straight through the varnish. If you're going to say you take responsibility, take it in one sentence, on one decision, without a paragraph of context. The room went from televised civility to courtroom cross-examination in under half a minute. Jake Tapper tried to pull it back toward the format because moderators are paid to keep the edges sanded down. Shapiro kept his tone level and pushed the question forward anyway, as if the words yes or no were a crowbar. Clinton's expression tightened, not angry exactly, more like someone watching an elevator door close on the floor she meant to exit. She reached for the standard escape hatch. "This has been reviewed," and he refused to follow her through it. That's the trick in modern political argument. Never chase the detour. Keep tapping the same nail until it either goes in or bends. What makes that opening exchange feel so combustible isn't the policy content. It's the optics of accountability. A politician says, "I take responsibility" in the abstract, because the abstract can't be fact-checked in real time. The moment you attach responsibility to a concrete choice, the sentence gets heavier because it brings along timelines, documents, and the kind of detail that doesn't fit into a warm smile. Clinton's instinct, like most veterans, was to widen the frame. Investigations, conclusions, institutional language. Shapiro's instinct was to narrow it to a point so sharp it couldn't be massaged into a different shape. And in that split-second clash, zoom out versus zoom in, you could practically hear millions of viewers picking a side before the first folder even opened. CNN had staged the night like a rehabilitation exercise, the kind that's supposed to feel serious but safe. You could sense the set design doing half the persuasion: flags, polished glass, controlled lighting, a studio audience trained to react like a metronome. Clinton walked out looking like she'd done this in her sleep, because she has, more times than most people have done anything. Shapiro walked out looking like he hadn't come to be liked, and that alone changes the temperature. Tapper stood between them with the expression of a man who could already see the segment producers sweating. The network wanted a conversation, but America has been craving something closer to confrontation. Clinton's opening was the standard greatest hits medley. Families, safety, service, values, hard lessons, moving forward. It's not that any of those themes are illegitimate. It's that repetition turns them into wallpaper. Shapiro's opening, by contrast, wasn't inspirational. It was evidentiary, and that is always jarring in a format built for vibes. He held up 3 folders like props, which is theatrical in its own way, but it signals a different kind of performance. Not charisma, but citation. He didn't call them opposition research, because that phrase is designed to make facts sound partisan. Instead, he framed them as publicly available records, statements, transcripts, findings, that people could argue about but not pretend don't exist. And if you've spent years watching politics as storytelling, that shift feels like someone suddenly turning the lights on. Tapper tried to reset the rules gently, the way referees do when the crowd is getting restless. Shapiro's response wasn't rude so much as relentless. Respect means answering, not gliding. Clinton smiled again, the defensive smile, and tried to reroute the conversation toward policy, which is what politicians do when the topic is personal judgment. Shapiro refused the reroute and made it about congruence. If you claim responsibility, demonstrate it in a sentence. That's not a legal standard. but it's a human one, the same standard voters use in their living rooms. The tension wasn't whether Clinton had heard the criticism before, it was whether she could confront it without turning it into a seminar. Shapiro opened his first folder and invoked the phrase that has echoed for years because it came from an institutional voice: extremely careless. That phrase, from James Comey's 2016 press conference, isn't a partisan slogan. It's part of the public record, and that's why it carries weight. Clinton's defense, as it has often been, leaned on the distinction between criminal intent and misconduct, between what's punishable and what's merely criticized. Shapiro's argument leaned on the distinction between legal exoneration and public trust, because those are not the same thing, no matter how often politicians try to merge them. He framed classified information not as a talking point, but as a real-world category tied to real-world risk. The kind of framing that makes viewers sit up because it feels concrete. And then he did what prosecutors do when they want to keep a witness from floating away. He returned to the question and asked it again. Clinton tried the well-worn line about things being thoroughly investigated, a phrase that functions like an exit sign. Shapiro treated that sign as decoration and asked whether investigation replaces accountability or merely describes it. The clash here is philosophical as much as political. Does surviving scrutiny mean you've earned trust, or does it mean you've learned how to navigate scrutiny? Clinton emphasized that prosecutors didn't pursue charges, because in politics, no charges often gets translated into case closed. Shapiro emphasized that case closed is not the same as nothing happened, especially when the criticism in question is about judgment rather than malice. You could almost see the two languages colliding: lawyerly clearance versus civic confidence. Then he moved into the part that always makes political consultants nervous: timelines. Dates don't have feelings, which is why they're so inconvenient. He talked about the subpoena period and deletion decisions in a way that didn't explicitly accuse anyone of a crime, but did what rhetorical questions do best: force the audience to imagine motive. Why does anything get erased after a subpoena arrives, even if someone insists it was personal? Why do devices get destroyed when a simple turnover would do, if everything is clean? Those questions don't convict anyone. They do something more dangerous in politics. They suggest a pattern that viewers can't unsee. Clinton's instinct was to argue process and intent. Shapiro's instinct was to argue perception and prudence. And in a debate watched by people who don't speak fluent legalese, perception tends to win. It wasn't just the email topic. It was the broader problem of modern political self-defense. The standard defensive move is to say, you're relitigating old controversies, as if time itself is a disinfectant. But old controversies don't fade when the public feels it never got a plain language answer, and plain language is Shapiro's brand when he's at his most effective. He framed the issue as a simple mismatch. Someone who presents as meticulous and competent shouldn't need a dozen paragraphs to answer a question about personal responsibility. Clinton didn't look stunned. She looked constrained, like someone being asked to speak in a dialect she refuses to use. That's a subtle difference, but the camera catches it, and viewers, rightly or wrongly, read constraint as calculation. From there, the debate slid into the terrain that always turns somber fast: Benghazi. Shapiro used a tactic that's common in adversarial settings. He contrasted private communications with public messaging, not to declare guilt, but to highlight inconsistency. Clinton's defenders have long argued that early information can be incomplete and public statements cautious. Her critics argue that caution becomes narrative management. Shapiro didn't need to call anyone evil to make the moment sting. He just needed to juxtapose what people believe they saw: confusion, shifting explanations, with words that suggest more certainty. The emotional center of Benghazi discourse has always been the families, and bringing them up raises the moral stakes instantly. But moral stakes are also where debates can turn unfair if they become accusations rather than questions. So the careful move is to focus on what was said, when, and why it changed. He invoked the "what difference at this point does it make" our line because it's one of those clips that lives forever precisely because it lands badly with ordinary people. Most voters hear that sentence and don't parse its bureaucratic intent. They hear dismissal. Clinton has explained it, others have defended it, but the line persists because it captures a vibe that her critics think defines her: impatience with public skepticism. Shapiro leaned into that vibe without having to label it, which is rhetorically smart and politically cruel. He didn't have to say, "You don't care." He let the quote do the insinuating. Clinton's likely impulse to contextualize the hearings, the stress, the tragedy, was the humane move, but humane moves often look evasive when the question is framed as binary. That's the trap with yes or no. It flattens reality and then punishes you for refusing to flatten yourself. Then came the foundation material, and here is where responsible narration matters, because sloppy claims become defamation fast. There are documented facts about donations, public reporting, and the appearance of conflicts. There are also exaggerated storylines that people treat as proven when they aren't. Shapiro, in this telling, pushes the viewer toward suspicion by stacking examples and asking how anyone is supposed to interpret them. Clinton responds with the familiar defense: charitable work, compliance frameworks, vetting, rules that allow philanthropy to coexist with public service. The audience, if it's honest, is left with the central discomfort. Even if something is technically permissible, can it still feel ethically corrosive? That question doesn't require a conviction. It requires a conscience. And politics has become the art of outsourcing conscience to your side's talking points. To keep the argument from turning into a crude accusation, the smart approach is to phrase it like a citizen's complaint rather than a prosecutor's conclusion. How does any public official maintain credibility while their family's nonprofit accepts large sums from interested parties, even if it's legal? Why do meetings and access correlate so often with donor lists in public reporting? And what does that do to public trust? How many coincidences can an exhausted electorate absorb before it decides it's looking at a system, not an outlier? Those are questions, not verdicts. And they're also the kind of questions that keep people listening because they feel like the unsaid part of the national conversation. Clinton's problem is that she's spent so many years being asked these questions that any answer sounds rehearsed. Shapiro's advantage is that he can sound fresh, even when he's reciting something old. He widened his frame into the long-running critique that Clinton's relationship with truth is strategic. And this is where tone becomes everything. There's a difference between saying there have been controversies and saying you are the biggest liar, and one of those turns your piece into personal attack. The sharper move is to make the viewer feel the pattern without turning it into a name-calling contest. Shapiro's script does that by pulling in Bosnia as a symbolic moment, the famous footage of a safe arrival versus a later anecdote that sounded far more dramatic. Clinton has addressed it as a misstatement. Critics treat it as emblematic. The point, for a commentator, isn't to adjudicate her soul. It's to observe how repeated disputes, large or small, shape a public's willingness to believe you. Trust is cumulative, and so is doubt. He touched the deplorables remark because it functions like a cultural scar, not because it's the only insult in politics, but because it came from a figure who presented as above that sort of thing. Clinton supporters argue it was aimed at a subset, not half of America. Critics argue the contempt was the tell. In a debate setting, Shapiro uses it as a character exhibit. Not you hate people, but you talk about people in a way that reveals distance. Clinton counters, as politicians do, with the language of inclusion and moving forward. The viewer is left with a quieter question that's more interesting than the insult itself. Do elites ever really understand how they sound to the people they claim to serve? When you've lived in a world of donors, staffers, and curated audiences for decades, can you still speak in a way that feels human rather than managerial? That question hangs in the air longer than any viral clip. As the debate escalates, the real drama isn't gotcha. It's the collision of two moral styles. Clinton's style is institutional: process, context, committees, investigations, outcomes. Shapiro's style is prosecutorial populist: directness, yet phrasing, forcing a witness to inhabit the discomfort of the public's skepticism. Neither style is inherently virtuous. Both can be manipulative in the wrong hands. But in a media culture saturated with spin, the prosecutorial style feels like relief to many viewers. It's why so many people cheer for "just answer the question," even when they know the question is designed to simplify. The hunger isn't for simplicity, because people are stupid. It's for clarity, because they're tired. And tired people don't reward nuance. At some point, Shapiro arrives at the question that plays like a guillotine without mentioning anything violent. Why should anyone trust you? That question isn't a legal indictment, it's a civic audit. And it's devastating because it doesn't allow a policy pivot. You can't answer it with a proposal about healthcare, because it's not about what you'll do. It's about whether your words are bankable. Clinton reaches for biography, service, experience, resilience, because biography is the traditional substitute for trust. Shapiro rejects biography as collateral and returns to the ledger, a record with disputed entries. The camera feeds on the pause because pauses are where viewers project their own conclusions, and the longer a politician waits, the more the public fills the silence with whatever it already believes. If you're telling this story as commentary rather than propaganda, you have to acknowledge the trick inside the trick. Shapiro's yes or no framing creates the illusion that complex controversies can be resolved like a light switch. Clinton's contextual answers create the impression of avoidance, even when they might be substantively accurate. Both dynamics are engineered, and both are effective on their intended audiences. The debate, in other words, isn't purely truth versus lies. It's competing methods of persuasion, each claiming the mantle of honesty. The public mistake is assuming that a confident question automatically equals moral superiority. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it's just a sharper blade. And politics is full of sharp blades that cut in whatever direction the wielder prefers. But if you strip out the theatrics and focus on what viewers experience emotionally, you can understand why this kind of scene catches fire. People don't want another performance of competence. They want an admission that sounds like a human being, not a legal department. Clinton, precisely because she's disciplined, struggles to deliver that kind of admission without sounding as if she's conceding something she won't concede. Shapiro, precisely because he's combative, can sound like the voice of the frustrated voter even if he's also performing. The moderator, precisely because he's tasked with balance, ends up looking like the only person in the room who can't pick a lane. That dynamic plays out across American life now. The referee gets booed, the fighters get clipped, and the audience pretends it's watching truth rather than entertainment. The lines blur, and then everyone insists the blur is reality. What comes next in the story isn't a single knockout line. It's the slow accumulation of moments that feel like a pattern. A question repeated. A dodge perceived. A quote replayed. A document held up to the camera. A pause, where an answer should have been. This is how political narratives calcify, and it's why the aftermath matters as much as the exchange itself. In the hours after the debate, people won't rewatch the full context. They'll rewatch the 10 seconds that confirms what they already think. Clinton's supporters will highlight Shapiro's aggressiveness and say he came to grandstand. Shapiro's supporters will highlight Clinton's non-answers and say she came to glide. And the majority of America, the exhausted center, will just take in the vibe and decide who looked more real. That's not justice, but it is how public judgment works. If there's an honest takeaway, it's this. Trust is the only non-renewable resource in politics. Once the public decides your explanations are always strategic, every explanation becomes a liability. Once the public decides your critics are always malicious, every critique becomes a conspiracy. Both instincts are understandable, and both are corrosive. Clinton's long career makes her a magnet for suspicion even when she's being sincere, because sincerity doesn't erase history. Shapiro's long career as a polemicist makes him a magnet for skepticism even when he's citing record, because citation doesn't erase motive. The viewer is left not with a clean verdict, but with a pressure point. The American demand for leaders who will speak plainly about their own choices, and the American fear that plain speech will be punished the moment it's offered. That's the paradox that makes this whole setup feel like it could happen again, with different names, next week. We keep staging accountability as entertainment, and then acting shocked when it produces spectacle rather than clarity. We keep rewarding the sharpest question and punishing the messiest, truthful answer. We keep telling ourselves that investigations settle trust, when trust lives in a different part of the brain than verdicts do. And we keep confusing institutional survival with moral credibility, because it's comforting to believe the system filters out the unworthy. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it filters out the naive and leaves the skilled. A debate like this, real or imagined, becomes a mirror, not just of Clinton or Shapiro, but of the public appetite that made their clash inevitable. And the scariest part is how many people will watch it, pick a side, and call that side truth. Tapper tried to rescue the format with the kind of gentle scolding moderators keep in their back pocket, but it landed like a napkin in a rainstorm. He reminded the audience this was a discussion, not a deposition, and both camps heard what they wanted. Clinton heard permission to broaden. Shapiro heard proof the referee was worried. Clinton straightened her notes like she could realign the night by aligning the paper, and Shapiro watched her the way a guy watches a magician's hands. The studio had that strange live TV silence where you can feel hundreds of people deciding whether to clap before they do it. Then Shapiro did what he'd been doing all night. He refused to let the conversation become a fog machine. Clinton tried to pivot into a safer lane by talking about standards, procedures, and lessons learned. The vocabulary of someone who knows the rules are her home field advantage. Shapiro responded with a different vocabulary. Plain, simple, direct. The words people use when they're convinced you're hiding behind syllables. This is the part that drives political professionals insane, because simple is rarely accurate, but it's always persuasive. Tapper asked a question designed to sound broad and statesmanlike. Trust in institutions, faith in democracy, the usual. Shapiro treated it like a distraction and brought it right back to the living room question. Do you own what happened, or do you manage it? Clinton's posture shifted in a way the camera can't help but exaggerate, because posture is the closest thing to truth we have in a performance sport. She looked less like a candidate and more like a witness who knows the examiner won't stop at the first answer. When she spoke, she sounded careful, which is what you sound like when you've spent decades learning which verbs create liabilities. She said she had regrets, which is a politician's favorite currency because it buys sympathy without purchasing responsibility. Shapiro heard regrets and treated it like counterfeit unless it came with specifics. He asked the same kind of question again, and you could see why it works. Repetition is a pressure tactic, and pressure makes people reveal their habits. Clinton's habit is to widen context, to build a protective perimeter of process and precedent around a vulnerable point. Shapiro's habit is to shrink context, to isolate the vulnerable point until it can't hide in a crowd of explanations. Neither habit is pure. Both are strategies, and the audience senses that even if it can't name it. The difference is that one strategy sounds like power protecting itself, and the other sounds like the public demanding a receipt. Tapper tried to move them onto "What would you do now?" a classic way to turn controversy into forward motion. Clinton was happy to go there, because the future is the easiest place to sound virtuous. It hasn't happened yet, so it can't contradict you. Shapiro wouldn't let her, because the future only matters if the past doesn't undermine your credibility to speak about it. He asked about trust again, and this time the question hit harder because it wasn't about a single decision, it was about the pattern the public thinks it sees. Clinton responded with the phrase that always sounds noble and always feels slippery. "I've devoted my life to service." Here's the thing about service in American politics. It's both true and meaningless at the same time. People can devote their lives to service and still make bad decisions, and voters don't stop caring about the decisions just because the resume is long. Shapiro's move was to say, in effect, that service doesn't automatically certify honesty, and experience doesn't automatically create trust. That's an uncomfortable claim for the establishment, but it's catnip for everyone who believes the establishment grades its own homework. Clinton's move was to emphasize outcomes, programs, initiatives, diplomacy, because outcomes are the easiest way to argue you've been useful. The studio audience, carefully curated or not, still responded like a normal American crowd responds when it feels the tension rising. They didn't clap much, because clapping is risky when you don't know which way the room is leaning, but you could hear the small murmurs, the little involuntary sounds people make when a line lands or a dodge feels too obvious. Shapiro didn't smirk, which would have made him look petty. He just kept the same controlled cadence, like he was reading a checklist. Clinton didn't snap, which would have made her look brittle. She stayed composed, which is both her strength and the reason critics say she feels remote. Then came the moment where the debate stopped being about Clinton and Shapiro and started being about the audience's own relationship with politics. Shapiro framed trust as a moral issue, truth-telling as a civic duty, without turning it into a sermon, because sermons lose people. Clinton framed trust as a governance issue, stable institutions, experience under fire, because governance is her natural language. The public, watching, wasn't grading which philosophy was more elegant. They were grading which one sounded more human. And human, in 2025, America tends to mean admitted something that cost you, not explained something that protected you. Clinton finally offered something closer to an admission, but it came wrapped in the kind of careful phrasing that makes admissions feel negotiated. She said she should have made different choices, and that, in hindsight, she would have handled some matters differently. That sounds reasonable, but it also sounds like the kind of sentence that could apply to anything from a parking ticket to a war. Shapiro pressed on whether she could name a choice, not a category of choices, because naming is what makes an apology real to ordinary people. It's the difference between "mistakes were made" and "I did this." Tapper tried to help by asking Clinton directly whether she would do the email setup again, in the simplest language he could manage without sounding like a tabloid. Clinton didn't say no, the way people say no when they mean it. She said, "I wouldn't do it that way," which is not the same sentence. Shapiro seized the gap, not because the gap proved a crime, but because the gap suggested instinct. Even now, she won't speak in absolutes about her own decisions. The audience at home can forgive a lot, but it hates the sensation that a person is still negotiating with the truth. That sensation is the real political toxin, more than any single scandal. At some point, you could almost see Clinton realizing that the debate wasn't really being fought on the facts anymore. It was being fought on feel, and her feel is competence with a steel spine, which reads to her supporters as reassuring and to her critics as cold. Shapiro's feel is relentless precision, which reads to his supporters as integrity and to his critics as smugness. Those are vibes, not verdicts, and politics is mostly vibe now, which is why these matchups are so combustible. A debate like this becomes less about persuasion and more about confirmation, like two playlists playing over each other and each side dancing to its own beat. Clinton tried to reclaim the human frame by talking about the cost of public life, the ugliness of modern discourse, the toll of being turned into a symbol. That's real, by the way, and pretending it isn't is part of why politics keeps getting more toxic. But the minute she leaned into that lane, Shapiro framed it as deflection. Sympathy isn't an answer. Biography isn't accountability. Tapper looked like he wanted to say, "Can we just get one clean segment?" But clean segments are for people who don't show up with folders. And Clinton's team, watching backstage, probably felt the same dread every campaign staffer feels when the narrative is slipping out of their hands. Shapiro then did something that, strategically, was smarter than another pile-on. He made it about the system, not just the person. He asked, again as a question, not a verdict, whether America has developed a two-tier language for accountability. One language for regular people, where mistakes come with consequences, and another language for the powerful, where mistakes become complex situations that fade with time. He didn't have to accuse Clinton of being above the law to imply that politics often behaves like it's above the public's patience. Clinton responded by saying the system worked. Investigations happened. Findings were issued. And that is the classic institutional defense. The process exists. Therefore, trust should follow. But process exists doesn't automatically rebuild trust, because process can look like a maze. When people feel the maze is designed by insiders, every exit feels like a hidden door. That's why no charges can still leave a cloud, and why cleared can still sound like connected. It's not fair in the legal sense, but politics has never been a courtroom. It's a relationship, and relationships are built on tone as much as facts. Clinton's tone is caution and control, and in an era addicted to bluntness, control can read like concealment. Tapper finally got them onto a policy question, foreign policy naturally, because it's where Clinton is strongest, and where Shapiro can't just repeat yes or no forever. Clinton came alive talking about alliances, deterrence, diplomacy, the kind of material that makes her look like an adult in the room. Shapiro didn't dispute her vocabulary. He disputed the premise that expertise can substitute for trust. He made the argument, again without a direct accusation, that competence without credibility is how you get disasters that are managed well after they happen. Clinton tried to say credibility comes from experience, and Shapiro tried to say credibility comes from candor, and those are two different religions. The debate shifted into that strange phase where both participants are no longer answering each other. They're addressing the audience through each other. Clinton spoke as if she was talking to suburban swing voters who want stability and normalcy back. Shapiro spoke as if he was talking to disillusioned citizens who think normalcy is just a nicer word for getting played. Tapper became the guy in the middle, trying to keep the conversation from turning into two separate monologues. And the cameras did what cameras always do. They hunted for micro-expressions, the flicker of irritation, the half-smile, the swallowed sigh. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, where Clinton laughed softly at something Shapiro said. And it wasn't a warm laugh. It was the laugh of someone who thinks the premise itself is unserious, which is a risky reaction in a country where half the audience already thinks you don't take them seriously. Shapiro didn't take the bait, which was discipline, because responding to that laugh would have made him look thin-skinned. Instead, he asked another question about whether Clinton understood why people distrust her, not whether she thought they should. Clinton answered that she did understand, but her answer sounded like the kind of understanding you write into a speech, not the kind you say to a friend. If you're looking for why these debates go viral, it's not the facts versus feelings meme. It's that the audience can smell when someone is speaking to them versus speaking at them, and it reacts like a dog hearing a familiar car pull into the driveway. Clinton speaks at the country the way leaders do when they think the country is an institution to be managed. Shapiro speaks to the country the way commentators do when they think the country is a jury. Neither posture is inherently wrong, but they produce totally different emotional responses. And, in an attention economy, emotion is the currency that buys replay. The funniest part, darkly funny, because American politics is always a little tragic, is that both sides believe they're the ones defending democracy. Clinton defends it by defending institutions, which is the old-school liberal instinct. Shapiro defends it by demanding moral clarity, which is the populist conservative instinct. They clash because each assumes the other's instinct is either naive or cynical, and neither wants to grant the other good faith. The audience, meanwhile, isn't necessarily choosing between two moral visions, it's choosing between two kinds of fatigue. There's fatigue with chaos, which makes Clinton's steadiness attractive, and fatigue with spin, which makes Shapiro's bluntness attractive. Both fatigues are real, and the country has both at once, which is why elections now feel like coin flips that decide destiny. Tapper tried to close the segment with a final thought question, hoping for a dignified wrap-up. Shapiro returned, one last time, to that same civic audit. If leadership is trust, and trust requires truth, what does truth look like from someone accused of managing reality like a brand? Clinton said truth looks like public service, results, and resilience, and Shapiro said truth looks like ownership, precision, and the willingness to say the uncomfortable sentence out loud. The debate ended not with a single mic drop moment, but with two competing definitions of accountability staring at each other under studio lights. Clinton's closing sounded presidential in the traditional sense, steady, inclusive, forward-looking, a little bloodless. Shapiro's closing sounded prosecutorial in the cultural sense, focused, skeptical, impatient with abstraction, suspicious of power's self-certification. Tapper thanked them with that tight smile broadcasters wear when they know the post-show analysis will be a knife fight. And the audience at home, wherever they were sitting, couch, kitchen table, bar stool, did what Americans do now. They didn't ask who won, they asked who felt real. Because real has become our substitute for right, and that's the quiet danger in all of this. A person can feel real and still be wrong, just as a person can feel managed and still be correct. But the Republic doesn't run on correctness alone. It runs on legitimacy, and legitimacy is stitched together from trust. When a public figure can't, or won't, answer in the language the public recognizes as honest, the stitches start to pop. And when a challenger frames every complex story as a simple binary, The stitching becomes a weapon instead of a repair. So the aftershock isn't just whether Clinton looked evasive or Shapiro looked aggressive. It's the larger question this kind of spectacle raises. Can America still have accountability without turning it into entertainment? And can it still have nuance without turning it into camouflage? Do we actually want leaders who say hard truths plainly, even when it hurts them? Or do we just want the thrill of watching someone else get cornered? Do we demand responsibility because we care about ethics, or because we enjoy the moment, the powerful look uncomfortable? Those aren't questions about Hillary Clinton or Ben Shapiro. They're questions about us, and they don't have clean answers.